Today, I'll show you how to make this gorgeous linen dress with a tiered skirt. I used the Oona sewing pattern from Vikisews patterns, which I altered a bit to suit my taste. First, I will show you how to make bias tape out of fabric and create casing for elastic. Before sewing, please watch part 1 to see how I changed the pattern. For a bias tape, choose light thin cotton fabric. It will be better than ready ones that are quite thick. If the fabric is slippering on the table, place another piece of cotton fabric to stabilize it on the table. The fabric is pre-treated, ironed with steam. Now, draw a square 20 by 20 centimeters in the corner of the fabric. We are working with one layer of fabric. Draw a diagonal line. I will need 2 pieces of 90 cm long and 3 cm wide for the neckline gathering. You can split the bias tape in 2 pieces and then put them together. This way, in total, you will have 4 pieces for the neckline, and you will consume less fabric for making a bias tape. To join 2 pieces of the bias tape, the edges should have 45-degree angle. With right sides together, put together 2 edges. Stitch length is 2 mm. Stitch 5 mm from the edge. No back stitching. Press the seam flat, and then press the seam allowances open. Trim the excess. If you have a bias tape maker, use it. I'm using a needle. The final result should be 1 cm wide. Take your time. In the middle of the sleeve, above the seam allowance line, we need to glue interfacing. Cut 2 pieces of interfacing, 1 by 4 centimeters. The side with glue is facing the wrong side of the fabric. Add as well interfacing in the middle of the facing of the skirt. On the right side of the neckline ruffle, make a roller hem using a serger. Set the sewing machine to a 4 to 5 mm stitch length and create a slight ruffle. Pull the lower thread. Now, you need to join 2 pieces of the neckline ruffle together. Wrong sides together. 5 mm seam allowance. Leave 3 mm seam allowance. with right sides together. Stitch 5 mm from the edge. The ready ruffle should be equal to the neckline measurement plus 2 centimeters for the seams. As well as the bias tape. With right sides together. Pin back to front at sides. Stitch 1 cm seam allowance. With the bodice back up, serge the seam allowances. Press the seams flat. Then press the seam allowances towards the front. The markings for the buttonholes are 5 mm above the seam allowance line. The distance between the buttonholes is about 1 to 2 centimeters. Transfer the markings to the right side. The length of the buttonholes is around 1.3 centimeters. Now we need to mark the position of the buttonholes on the facing of the skirt. So, on the right side of the facing, I'm marking the seam allowances in the center. Make the buttonholes on the machine. Carefully make the cut. I placed a needle at the end of the buttonhole to avoid cutting beyond it. Now I'm going to make a rolled hem on the right side of the bottom of the sleeve. The hem can be done now or later. To sew the sleeves, I decided to make a French seam. With wrong sides together, pin the sleeves at sides. Stitch 5 mm from the edge. Backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. Leave around 3 mm seam allowance. Turn the sleeve to the wrong side. Press the seam flat. Pin, baste stitch if necessary, and sew on the machine 5 mm from the fold. Stitch on the wrong side. Press the seam flat. Then press the seam allowance towards the front part of the sleeve. Double check the length of the bias tape needed for the bottom of the sleeves. Place it above the original seam allowance line. There should be a 1 cm overlap. Seam allowance is 5 mm. Now we need to close the circle. Be careful not to twist the tape. we need to attach the bias tape to the sleeve. The bottom of the tape should be on top of the line. If you can, top stitch 1 millimeter from the edges right away. Or, you can baste stitch first 2 millimeters from the edge. And then top stitch 1 millimeter from the edge. Remove the basting stitches. Press it flat. Now, with right sides up, pin the sleeves to the bodice. Stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Finish the edges with the serger. Stitch on top of the bodice. Press the seam flat. Then press the seam towards the sleeve. Press the seam allowance of the ruffle flat. With right sides together, pin the center of the neckline ruffle to the center back. The front of the bodice can stretch out a bit because the neckline is cut on bias. Spread the ease evenly if necessary. One centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam flat. Pin right side of the bias tape to the wrong side of the ruffle. I'm starting to pin the bias tape from the back center. Don't cut anything until the whole bias tape is attached. 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm removing the temporary stitches from the ruffle. Now we need to trim the seam allowances. Leave around 3 millimeters. We are cutting only the seam allowances. Be careful not to cut the bias tape. You can flip the bodice to the other side to see what you are cutting. And cut from the side of the tape. Press the seam flat. Then, press the bias tape upward. Measure 1.2 centimeters if your elastic tape is 1 centimeter wide, or measure 1 centimeter if it is 8 millimeters wide, and draw a continuous line. Press the bias tape towards the bodice. Now we need to tuck in the seam allowance inside. Fold the seam allowance at the bottom of the bodice to the wrong side. Baste stitch 2 millimeters from the edge, or pin the bias tape to the bodice. And top stitch 1 millimeter from the edge of the tape. Now fold half of the seam allowance of the bodice and secure with pins. Press the seam allowance flat. Press the finished casing for the elastic tape as well. Stitch 1 millimeter from the fold line. To make strings, you will need this tool, loop turner, or this adjustable bias tape binder foot. To make strings for the sleeves, fold the piece in half with the right sides together. Stitch around 7 millimeters from the fold. Trim the seam allowance, leaving 3 millimeters. Turn the straps right side out. My fabric was fraying a lot, so I could not pull the hook too much. If the hook rips the fabric while inside the strap, don't panic. Try to retrieve the end of the strap from inside. I had to do this several times. Try to feel for the end of the string and hold it instead of pulling on the hook to reduce the pressure on it. Press the strings flat. Use a bodkin or a small safety pin to thread the strings through the buttonholes. I'm using 1 centimeter wide elastic tape. The length of the elastic is indicated on the pattern. It's better to make a fitting. That's it for today. In the next video, I'll show you how to make the skirt and add ruffles to the waist. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Bye!